Hey everyone, so for assignment 7 this week, we had to create a graphic object class designed to handle shading using the texture that we defined a while ago. So I created a graphic object texture class, and instead of using color and a mesh of colors, it uses a texture. And also I defined the mesh of textures as well. And then I created two new methods for setting the texture, both it to define the texture solely or if it needs to have a mesh number. And then in our constructor for the graphic object texture class, I had to create a default texture and I assigned it to test2. And then when I created the mesh of textures, I assigned each of those to the default texture. And then in my init demo, I define the shader that I'm using, the shader texture, create the textures, create the models, create the graphic object, and then set the texture to the appropriate texture that I defined earlier, and set the world matrices. And then in my draw scene, I am setting to context the shader texture that I'm using and setting the camera matrices, and then rendering each of those graphic objects. And I get here both of the objects, the cube models, and with their appropriate textures. And then for problem 2, I had to create a graphic object class designed to handle color shading using light. And in particular, I had to make sure that material properties were managed by this graphic object. So so I created a new graphic object called graphic object color light, and it's basically like the color graphic object. The only thing that I kind of added was mesh materials and a material variable which takes in the material, and I can set the material, and the material takes in the ambient, the diffuse, and the specular vectors. And also I did it again for the mesh because this is going to play a role for problem 4. So in my main app right here, I'm defining the shader that I'm using, the color light, and then defining the directional light and the point light. And the point light is going to be yellow coming from the bottom, and the directional light's pointing from the top. And it's going to be white. And then so here I define the models that I'm using, and then I'm defining the graphic object that I'm using, the color light one, and setting up the ambient, diffuse, and specular parameters, and then setting the material for both of the objects, and then setting the world matrices, and then rendering those using the shader color light. And of course you have to define the eye position as well for this. And also I attached a spotlight to the rotating cube that is rotating around the central one. So if I run this, I get the yellow one and the purple cube, and it's rotating with the spotlight. And as you can see, the bottom has a yellow tint to it, and purple plus yellow, I guess, equals red. And the top. So that was problem 2. Problem 3 was to do the same thing, but instead of using color shading, we're supposed to use texture shading. So I created a graphic object texture light, and with the same thing, I'm still using texture and a mesh of textures. I added materials and a mesh of materials, and I added two new methods for set material and set material if mesh number was given. And here in the constructor, again, I'm defining the texture and the mesh of textures, and then the mesh of materials. And then in my main app right here, setting the direction light, again, coming from the top, and then setting the point light coming from the bottom. And then defining the models, defining the textures, defining the graphic object, setting the material, setting the texture. And then same thing for graphic object 2, setting the matrices, and then going down, and then using the texture shader light shader, and then define the eye position, and then rendering that. And then I added again the rotating texture, which I believe is a dice cube, has a spotlight attached to it, and then the central cube is the crate. So yeah, as you can see here, we have the dice cube going around the central crate, and that is that. And then for problem number 4, we had to modify all the above graphic object classes to incorporate the relevant properties on a per mesh basis. So I already did this for the first 3 problems. That's why you noticed that I had the mesh count, the mesh number, and two different definitions for set texture and set material, and again for set color as well, where I was using mesh numbers, and then I also defined the mesh materials and mesh textures because I knew in advance that I would have to do this, so might want to just do it with two birds with one stone. So in our init demo, I'm using the same texture light again, setting the same directional light, same point light, but now I'm defining 5 textures, and then defining the models, and I'm using the cottage model that was provided, and that's graphic object 1. So here I'm setting the diffuse, and here I'm setting the material and also setting the texture for each of the meshes. And as you'll see, I think texture 1 is the wall, texture 2 is the tiles, texture 3 is the bricks, and texture 4 is the door. So you'll see that once I start this, and then the other graphic object doesn't really have any mesh numbers to utilize, or different meshes to utilize, so it's just going to be that dice rolling around, rotating around the cottage with the spotlight on it attached to it. And as you can see, the dice is in fact rotating around the cottage with the spotlight attached, and these are the different mesh zones. You see the wall, the door, the tiles for the roof, and then the brick chimney, and then the spotlight, the yellow spotlight at the bottom. And so that's number 4. And then in terms of further work, the current arrangement for graphic objects and mesh forces each mesh to be rendered with the same shader. Only the specific shader properties can vary per mesh. What if we needed to allow different shaders per model? For example, one mesh uses color, one mesh uses texture, and the third mesh uses lighting effects. How would you organize code classes to allow for this? I think what I would do is, back in my shader gate graphic object, I would have different methods to say set shader, and then I would set the shader before I set the texture and set the material. So I would have a method that would set the textures, set the shaders for that particular mesh number. And I think that is everything for assignment 7. Thanks for watching.